was the first time I ever read him. And I read about 200 pages, and I lost maybe. I found him very, very.
The book's only about 240 something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and said.
But it's the very first time I read a book that I found that he was so overly wordy on everything.
Well, this is his style. I mean, I must say that I have not read, I don't know if anybody's read, he's written things in between Snow Falling on Cedars in 1994, although that's the book that made him famous. Seems to have made him quite well off as well, because before that, and he was, well, let me tell you a little bit about him. He's an interesting fellow. He was born in 1956, which makes him 67 years old. He was born in Seattle, Washington, the son of Murray Bernard and Shirley. So I'm thinking, it sounds like a Jewish name, but anyways, I looked him up, and yes, his parents were Jewish. He's definitely not, it never, at least not in the bits that I've read by him, or the books that I've read by him, or the essays, that doesn't come into play. But he was born in Seattle, Washington, and he's lived there on the West Coast all of his life. And that's where he sets all his books. Like, if you'll remember Snow Falling on Cedars, which I'll tell you just a little bit about, because that was the book that he said that made him well known in the publishing world. And but he grew up there. He has 4 children. One of them is adopted from Ethiopia, which, if you've read the book, because what is the book, got its idea, he said, from a real case that happened, that a family adopted children. And I think in the real case, there were 2 children adopted from Ethiopia, and they happened to be, I guess you classify them, I don't like classifying things, but fundamental Christians who had not that all fundamental Christians would do this, or anybody would do this, but they had a very strict and very particular way of raising children. And one of the children, this is the real case, one of the children she died as a result, it seems, of abuse at the hands of her adopted parents. And David Guterson, who knew about the case, also he had adopted a girl from Ethiopia, so for him it rang particularly close to home. And that gave him, and then there was the trial, and he attended the trial, and that gave him the idea for this book. So when I said it's fiction, because he's written nonfiction as well, it's interesting because for those of you who read the book, you'll know that he says very clearly, like at the beginning, he says, the narrator is an unnamed, you never find out his name, the narrator, and he says, I used to write fiction, but I've given up writing fiction. So kind of an interesting opening statement by the author of a novel. In any case, so David Guterson, as I said, was born in Seattle, Washington, and he's lived there his whole life. He went to the University of Washington, where he went to college. And he was an English teacher for a number of years, so about 10 years, actually, until Snow Falling on Cedars came out. And then he didn't need to have a day job anymore, because he did well enough from that, and then the rights to the movie. So, but for 10 years, he was an English teacher. And a little bit ironically, he and his wife homeschooled their children. And that's in the book also, because this couple, the couple who adopts the girl from Ethiopia, they have 7 children of their own, and before they adopted this girl, and they homeschool their children as well. So it's and he said in an interview, David Guterson, that I guess you could think that this is a little bit strange that I was an English teacher teaching in a public school, and I was homeschooling my children at the same time. I was just listening to an interview with him.
He also wrote a book called The Advantages
of Homeschooling. Yes, right. So he did. So that was among his body of work. He wrote that back in 1992, actually. He wrote that before Snow Falling on Cedars. He published, okay, let me tell you a little bit about what he wrote. His first publication was a collection of short stories called The Country Ahead of Us, The Country Behind. That was in 1989. Then his second book was a nonfiction book entitled Family Matters, subtitled Why Homeschooling Makes Sense, 1992, while he was still an English teacher there in the public school system. Then he wrote Snowfalling on Cedars in 1994. Then didn't have to be an English teacher in public school anymore. He wrote, his next novel was called East of the Mountains in 1999. So that's like 5 years between then. Then another book called Our Lady of the Forest. I don't know if anyone is familiar with any of his, I wasn't. Had you read the homeschooling book? Did you know about it, or you just
I saw the list.
you just saw it on the list? Okay, yeah, no, I was looking at the lady behind you. And he's a contributor, a regular contributor to periodicals, including Harper's, Sports Illustrated, and other sporting journals, because his hobbies, at least his interests as they are listed, are hiking and hunting. So, and then his last novel, which I thought again was interesting because the narrator in the book says, I used to write fiction. His last novel was in 2011, a book called Ed King. Have you read it? Ed, you read that one? Ed King, the name of a man, E.D. like Edward King. That was the title, 2011. So between, then there was a space of 11 years because this book was written, was published in 2022. So, and it, so I don't know what else he's going to write, but I just thought that was interesting. There was a big space of time between his last novel and this one. The only one I think so far that had been adapted into film was Snowfalling on Cedars. And do you remember, do any of you remember back to what that was about? Because that was very interesting. He wrote, it was about a fisherman who was accused. There was a trial, which recounted the trial of a Japanese man for the alleged killing of a Caucasian fisherman in the year 1954. And he said, David Guterson, he said that growing up where he grew up, the area, there were a lot of Japanese Americans. And we know what happened during the Second World War, that the Japanese Americans were relocated and placed in internment camps because they were considered to be possibly fifth columns, enemy aliens. And David Guterson said that then, and where does he live? He lives on a place called Bainbridge Island, which I guess if anybody knows Seattle, that's an island in the Seattle area in the Sound there. And his book Snowfalling on Cedars, there was a lot of description. Like it was really it evoked the place, the Pacific West Coast, rainy and damp and cedar trees, obviously, and fishing and very beautiful and very green. But he said, so he and his wife, he says in an interview that they moved to Bainbridge Island when they had their first child. And then it wasn't a fancy place. I think in subsequent years, it's become a very high-priced and very prestigious place to live. So how things change over the years. But he wrote, so he said that when he got the idea for that novel because he knew so many Japanese Americans who, like he said, when he went to high school, many of them, their families had been interned during the years of the Second World War. I guess it happened when Pearl Harbor, and America got into the war, and then that happened. So that was the impetus for Snowfalling on Cedars, and it was also a trial. That was also a trial. Trials appear in his books. Why? His father was a lawyer. He was a defense attorney, and he did similar to what the main character, or one of the main characters in the book, the father of the unnamed narrator, what he does is he's a defense attorney, and he always took on cases, as did David Guterson's father in real life, took on cases where the court appoints a defense attorney, often in cases where the crime is a horrible one. And usually, as he has the character, the father say, as he's explained to his son, 9 times out of 10, the accused is found guilty. But somebody has to defend them. That's the way the justice system works. As as uncomfortable or as morally repugnant as I might find the people I'm defending, this is the way the legal system works in America. Everybody is entitled to a fair trial. So somebody has to do the defending. So that first novel, Snow Falling on Cedars, there is a trial case, just as this one is. There's a bit of a love story in that one too, if you remember the Snow Falling on Cedars book. And in this case, I'll tell you about it in a minute. But so David Guterson has made his career always in the literary world. First, he was teaching English literature. Well, he studied English literature, then he taught English literature to high school students in a public school. And then are you looking for your mother? She's over there. And then he became an author and a novelist. And there he is at age 67, still living out there on Bainbridge Island and still writing. So he said that this is David Guterson talking, that his father, as I said, was a criminal defense lawyer, and he and his two brothers and two sisters grew up on the north end of Seattle. And he speaks very fondly of the region. He says that the woods nearby where they grew up they were very important in forming who I am, because we spent my siblings and my friends and we spent much of our childhood wandering around in the woods. So the outside world, the flora and fauna of the place is always very much part of his work. He said that as a child, he liked to read, but he never considered becoming a writer until his junior year of college, when he was inspired by the teacher of a short story writing class. And why did he do that? How come he didn't become a criminal lawyer like his father? He said he thought about going to law school. But then this English course in his junior year of college, under his teacher said to the class that stories really matter. That when people read well-written stories, they can be transfigured by those stories. So David Guterson was young and idealistic, and he thought, okay, this is how I can transform lives. This isn't a bad idea. And he said that he went to the library and he started to work on his first story. And I thought, oh, this is fun. And if it's meaningful and useful as well, I think I could do this. But he said I couldn't make a living out of it quite then. So I became a teacher, and that was my day job. And I taught and as I said, he taught for 10 years English in a public school. And but during the summers, he worked on his stories, and if he had any spare time, he worked on his stories. He also said, at one point, interestingly, that he had worked summers as a student as a firefighter, and he thought that maybe that would be an interesting profession. You're also helping people, obviously, and you're helping, your surroundings. But after his interest in writing grew, he decided that he was going to focus his efforts not on becoming a firefighter, but rather first becoming this English teacher and writing on the side. So, and as I said, that they moved to this Bainbridge Island and I don't know how you pronounce it, Puget Sound? Puget Sound, okay. Puget Sound, which at the time when they moved was home to 8,000 people. But by the year 2000, the population had more than doubled. And as I said, it became a pretty upscale neighborhood. So he said that when he first started to write, it wasn't very easy. If he could write 250 words a day, which is roughly about a page, right? Then he was very, very pleased with himself. Because he said that for me, it's very important to get the words correct. And he says the more accurate our words are, the more clarified, this is a writer speaking, so to him, the more accurate he can describe the world in the right, with using the right words, then the more clarified the world is. So he says, to me as a writer, getting it right, meaning his selection of words and how he writes, feels almost like a holy act. So there you have somebody very dedicated, a writer who really feels that his profession is a calling. As I said, his first work was a collection of short stories. His first nonfiction work is the book on why homeschooling makes sense. And he said that he was asked to write that book, and he said, I know, you think it's a little bit odd that they asked me because I was a public school teacher, but I guess not so odd, because the same time as I was a public school teacher, I was also my wife and I were homeschooling our kids. And when he was asked, so, you taught in the public school, you didn't think that was good for your kids? And he said, no, my wife and I felt that it would be better and better for our children if we could homeschool them, because he said, I taught in public schools and I don't see it as the optimal system for children to put 30 kids in one class with one teacher and try and make everybody, have to do the same thing. But he said, being pragmatic, he said, but that's the best we have. I mean, we have to educate kids, and not all children can be homeschooled. But he felt that he and his wife, I guess obviously they were able to do that. And so that's what they were doing. So that's why he wrote that that nonfiction book. Snow Falling on Cedars, I already told you about. So he said that when he was asked which books influenced you, he said one of them was Harper Lee's classic novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, which most of us, or many, I don't know if they still do it, but was taught in English class in high school. And he said he presented that every year. He presented that story to his high school students, which was also happened to be about a trial, right? If you remember, I mean, that's what it was all about. Atticus Finch was the trial lawyer there in the South in that classic novel. So he said that maintaining historical accuracy in his books is something that's very, very important to him, which is why it took him such a long time to write his first book, which Snow Falling on Cedars paid off handsomely, bringing him fame and critical acclaim, and making him a very wealthy man through his book sales and the sale of movie rights. And he, as I said, he quit his job to devote himself full time to writing. And he said, and I thought this was interesting too, just kind of a little aside if you read the book, because at the end of the book, we know that his mother, who is a woman in her 80s, is suffering from a very painful back ailment. And Guterson himself, as a young man in his mid-30s, began to suffer from back trouble, a lot of back pain. And it was then, back like 30 years ago, that he began to grapple with issues surrounding aging. And that led to his next work of fiction, which was called East of the Mountains, which was about an older man, it was an older man story back when he was a younger man. And it's so interesting because now this book, like in this book, he's also writing, one of the themes that he's writing about is aging and human mortality. So in this book, so he said, just one final thing, and then I'll talk about the book. He once said in an interview, I write because something inner and unconscious forces me to. That is the first compulsion. The second is one of ethical and moral duty, which fits into this story. I feel responsible to tell stories that inspire readers to consider more deeply who they are. Although, and for him on a personal level, although his life changed in a material sense as a result of the success of Snow Falling on Cedars, because he didn't have to worry about bringing in a paycheck any longer or keeping that day job as a high school teacher, he didn't feel like it. He says he feels that he had taken those changes in stride. He said that even though he's considered to be a well-known author, it didn't really matter to him so much. He said, it might be entertaining for my 15 minutes, was that Andy Warhol's, everybody has their 15, well, not everybody, but you have your 15 minutes of fame. But he says, I feel like I'm ephemeral. I myself, as a human being, by definition, we are, we're human and we're ephemeral and our lives on this earth will end. But he said, what I hope lasts are my books. And so to me, stories matter. And if a story is well told and a story that presents human beings in crisis, deciding how to confront their struggles, how to be fully human. He says, stories deliver to us, us readers, the heroes of the common people. Without them, we wouldn't have culture, we wouldn't know who we are. So this is a writer who really believes that the act of writing fiction is not just, something light and fluffy to be dealt with as pure entertainment. Not to say that it isn't, and that doesn't have its own value, but that's not what David Guterson feels that he writes for. So to this book, so that was the introduction, the final case. And I always wondered, I wondered when I picked up the book and I thought, is this going to be his last book? I mean, he's not an old man. He's 60, relatively speaking. He's 67 years old. So, but I mean, that's the title of the book because it fits into the story. But when you read it, you think, I wonder, this is it? This is going to be the end of fiction for him, or it just happens to be the title of the book. So he divides the book. The book is divided into 3 sections. You have before the trial, and after the trial. Those are roughly the 3 sections of this book. His epithet, which is always interesting, you'll look at the beginning of the book and see what the author chooses to put, is a quote from George Eliot's book, Middlemarch. And this same quote appears later on towards the end of the book. If anybody, I'm sure you noticed it, I think you read the epitaph at the beginning of that. So what's the quote from Middlemarch? Because they always, whatever the author chooses to put at the front is always important because that's what he puts there to say, okay, my book is going to have something to do with this. Either it's clear or you have to figure this out by reading the book. So in this case, here's the quote. That things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. Read that. What? I don't know. I had to read it a few times over. It's George Eliot, so remember it's English. A couple of centuries ago, where English was a little different than how we speak now. So, and I can, when you have it in front of you, so you understand it better. But I'll just say it one more time, and then just that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been. So things could have been worse, and another way of saying it, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life, to those who lived faithfully a hidden life, and rest in unvisited tombs. Meaning, I guess, who lived a faithful life, a good, decent life, and who are buried, but who are not famous and don't, I think in that sense, the unvisited tombs. So they're not heroes of history that many people know. They're just, I guess, to me, this is like, who are the heroes in life? Decent, good, kind human beings. Anyway, this is the quote by George Eliot from her novel Middlemarch. And then next comes the author's note. And he tells us, in 2011, a girl adopted by a family in Skagit County, Washington, died of hypothermia. 2 years later, her adoptive parents were tried in court in connection with her death. The adopted girl came to this family from Ethiopia. The adopted parents were devoutly religious and had strong convictions about child rearing. I attended the trial and conducted research and interviews both in the US and Ethiopia. But to be clear, this book is a work of fiction. So he makes this very clear. I don't have it on my copy. It's not, because what I notice so often, as you must notice, the words a novel is very often written on the book, on the covers of books nowadays, just so you shouldn't think that this is not a novel and that the author, can be accused of getting facts wrong. It's not on the cover here, but he says this very clearly in his author's note. To be clear, this book is a work of fiction. Certainly, there are parallels here to what happened in the real world, but they are only parallels, not reality itself. And he said in interviews, when he's interviewed about the book, when he's asked, why did you not write this just as a record of the trial? And he said, because, well, he had a couple of answers. One of them, he said, the act of fiction writing, he says, it gives you much more flexibility. That's the word he used. He said, fiction writing is more flexible. When you're writing nonfiction, then if you have, moral convictions, then it should be true or whatever is closest to the truth. Okay, that's a tricky business too, because truth, people have different ideas of what's truth. And if you're researching something, you are dependent on what the research that you do and the research that you didn't do could also, so it's a little tricky. But I'll say that if you're writing nonfiction, you should be writing what is true, as best as can be ascertained. But when you're writing fiction, you could really do whatever you want, almost. But you definitely have flexibility. So that's what he said. He said that this makes it, and he said, yes, I attended this trial of this Ethiopian girl, whose parents were put on trial for abuse, resulting in her death of hypothermia. I went to the trial, and he said, I went to the trial because it was there, like it was in the area that he lived in. But also he said, because I had adopted a girl, my daughter was adopted from Ethiopia, and it could have been her that could have been in that family. So that was why it was particularly important for me to go to the trial and see what was going on. And that's what made it the topic of my novel. But he also said that if I was going to write only, even in a fictional way, only about the trial, it would have been a very dark and very upsetting story. So that's why, for those of you who read the book, you know that the trial is there in the center of the book, but in the before part and the after part, and even during as well, a bit, we have long passages about the narrator's family, his parents, his wife, his sister, and others. So it's not unrelieved evil or cruelty that we, the reader, has to deal with. And he said that's why he did it like that. That's why, even though he could have written in a nonfiction way only about the trial, he felt that that would have made the novel too hard to bear. And so he put in contrast to the family, showing the family that's on trial, because the girl who died was obviously not there able to present her own picture. We only get to know her, and that's what he said. We only get to know her through the eyes of her family members who are testifying, and anybody else who would be testifying at the trial. But the others, the family members of the narrator, they, in contrast, have loving, close, warm relationships, and they seem to be kind, decent people. So they are the contrast, and they are what enables, he feels, the reader to continue reading about such a difficult subject. And he begins in his prologue. He says, right, so he has a prologue, a short prologue before the first section, which is called pre-trial. He says in a prologue, my father was a criminal attorney. And if you know that David Gutterson's father was a criminal attorney, so it kind of, then you're thinking, aha, is he playing with us here? Like, is this one of these, like Philip Roth the late Philip Roth in his book, who he mentions, by the way, at the end of the book. And remember, we did this, I don't know how many years ago, we talked about Philip Roth's book, Patrimony, which was Philip Roth's tribute to his own father. And that was, I can't remember, I think that was classified as a novel, but it pretty clearly wasn't. So anyway, so this opening sentence here is a little bit disconcerting if you know that David Gutterson's father was a criminal attorney. And he continues, so he says, my father was a criminal attorney. In his office, case filed filled cabinets on all four walls. A few years ago, those files got transferred into boxes, and the boxes got stacked floor to ceiling in the room where I wrote novels. Chronologically arranged and tagged both with dates and surnames of clients, they formed a bulwark counterpointed by my windows. Outdoor light, then, had to run through tunnels constructed of my father's files before illuminating the pages I was working on. So I thought this was really the way he sets it up. So he tells you, my father's a criminal lawyer. He had files and files and files, like real, actual physical files. And the files that were in his office, they got transferred to my home office where I wrote my books. And they were stacked up against the windows. And in real life, apparently that's where David Gutterson has been writing, and his father's actual files were also transferred to his own office. And because he said in an interview, and there they were, these boxes and boxes of files from my father's cases that he had worked on his whole career. So again, like you get this, if you know this, like, is this a memoir? Because these are also happen to have written a memoir, but no, this is not a memoir. But obviously there are, things taken from his own life. So, and but just this description of light and how the light has to go through the boxes of his father's files. One morning, he says, as I'm sitting in a chair outside my recessed window and watching the wind swiveling the leaves around, I pulled out one of the files and I began to read it. And it's a case that his father had worked on in November 1955 about a woman who was seemed to have suffered from very severe mental health problems in the throes of mental illness, and she and schizophrenia, and she heard voices, and she had like a very, very severe mental illness. And the case was the state of Washington versus this woman, Teresa Wilton, his father being the defense lawyer for this woman back in 1955. This woman takes a revolver out of her husband's suitcase and shoots her husband. And then his father is asked to represent this woman. There were not yet public defenders in Seattle, he writes, which in 1955 had no freeway or skyscrapers. My father was 25 years old at that point, and this was his first case. And so he describes this first case of his father. And the woman is she's declared insane. She spends many years in a psychiatric institution. And then eventually she's let out. And what's sort of the point of this little prologue here, where the narrator, and he continues to be an unnamed narrator. We learned that his father's name is Royal. Tells you something, because it comes out that he is quite regal or royal in his in who he is, what kind of a man he is, in his morality and his decency. Narrator is unnamed. But the unnamed narrator says that he goes on and he looks through these files, and he tells us, like, he gives us a synopsis of those files. And then in November of 1958, so this was 3 years after the death of Frank Wilton, when my father was 28 years old, he sent Teresa, because his father had the power of attorney for this woman because she was spending those years in a psychiatric institution and not being sane enough to look after her own affairs. He sent her a check for $5,368.05, which was a remainder of her husband's life insurance payout once all the debts were settled. And then he sends her a check for interest, a second check in the amount of $36.54. And he says, no one, as far as I could tell, ever paid my father a dime. Case closed. So that's our introduction back. He wants to say, this is the kind of guy my father was. So he did this. He sent the woman all the money that she was owed when the estate was settled. And my father didn't get it. So, and that's the little prologue. And then the first section opens, it's called pre-trial. And that's where we get this sentence. A while back, I stopped writing fiction. I've been doing it for a long time. I'm not interested anymore. There are other things in life. And as I said, you don't know if this is David Gutterson talking, except that he's writing a work of fiction. So I guess it might not, it's his character talking, but interesting nonetheless. I'd be repeating myself. I became aware that thoughts like these, uninvited, unexpected, persistent, and gnawing, were proliferating in my head, and outweighed any urge to write fiction. At first, by a little, so that I stayed in the habit of writing, but then by a lot, so that I quit. And he said, that was a strange development for me. What was I going to do with myself now? That's what I've been doing for years. I've been writing fiction. So he said, I took walks. I looked at my house, what needed fixing up in my house. I went swimming twice a week with my wife to the public swimming pool, and we swam laps every Tuesday and Thursday. Once a week, we went to see a movie. About twice a week, we ate lunch in a cafe. My life clearly smacked now of bourgeois retirement. It's what he's saying. Predominantly, I cleaned, organized, repaired, and refurbished. And so the weeks went past without any fiction writing. Some days I was distressed to learn that it was noon already, but this perturbation from the start was mild, a pang at worst, or an ephemeral hollowness. More persistent, and here you get one of the themes that he's going to be talking about, more persistent was a vague intimation that at the heart of every moment of living, something was wrong. So he says, but like what? What am I going to do with myself now? And then the problem is solved, well, at least temporarily. He gets a phone call. He gets a phone call when he's outside doing something in his garden. His father calls him. Two things, says the father. First, a tree had fallen in his yard. Second, he had a minor car accident. The downed tree, while a nuisance, could wait indefinitely. The accident, though, was a problem because his car was undrivable and he had to be at work in the morning. No, he said, I didn't get hurt. No one got hurt. That's on the bright side. On the downside, I'm at fault. I know that. I can't blame someone else. I plowed into a parked car. I turned a corner and plowed into a car. And I sat there thinking, I know what this means. It's the beginning of the end for me. Your mother, my father went on, had a series of parking lot scrapes and then a serious fender bender. And the result is, for about 2 years now, she hasn't gotten behind the wheel of a car, which you know, of course, anyway. And we only had the one car, and now it's unusable. We're okay, though, in broad terms. And then he goes on to tell us, readers, they were okay in broad terms. They still lived in their house, even though they're using only a couple of rooms of the house now. They figured out which rooms they prefer. They didn't go upstairs very much anymore. Parents are in their 80s. And so he goes, being the good son. He lives 15 minutes away. Turns out that the sister, there were two of them in the family, lives also in Seattle, or near the parents. And he says, yeah, he goes to look at the tree, but the car. So his father realizes that, okay, maybe even if we fix the car, I probably shouldn't be driving anymore. Except that his father has just gotten called to work on a case. And what's the case? He's called because there are no public defenders available to take this case. So he gets this phone call, even though, as he tells his son, and like the way he writes this, you could just, it's so true. He says, his father says to him, I've been going to the office now for a number of years, but it's not really too much work for me, but I like to go every day because it gives me something to do. And he describes his father, who dresses in his not expensive suits with his clip-on ties and his, very much this is his, and his hair is combed back. It's always been in the same style, whatever hair is left of it. And in his briefcase is a newspaper and a bag of bran flakes. And every morning the routine is he goes to work and at 11 o'clock he goes downstairs and he goes to a store and he buys himself a banana and some milk and a coffee and he has breakfast. He eats his bran flakes with a banana and has his coffee, because there's not really so much work for him to do, but he still has the office and he wants to go. So he hasn't really been working in a very long time, but he's had a place to go. Now with no car, and so his son says, I'll be your driver. And the son acquires, the son who's decided that he no longer wants to write fiction and what's he going to do with himself, now has a job. He's going to be his father's driver. So he takes him to work a couple of times. And then the call comes in. They're looking for a public defender. And they ask his father, who's in his 80s, but still, fine, like mentally fine, to take on the case. And his father says yes. And so the son becomes involved in the case. And so that's the pre-trial situation. We know what's going on. And then is a description of the trial. And the son as the driver, and the trial is taking place in Skagit County Courthouse, which is quite a distance away. So every morning, our narrator now has to get up at 5 o'clock, go to pick up his father, drive his father to the courthouse, sit with him the whole day of the trial, and bring him home again at night. He also takes him to interview when he goes to visit the client. So it's a couple that is accused of abusing this adopted girl until she dies. They find her and they're accusing the parents of abuse leading to homicide. And so that's the father takes this case on because, as he said, even though usually, as he tells his son, 9 times out of 10, the accused is guilty, they are still entitled to a fair trial. So that's why he takes on this case. He goes and he interviews, but each of the like the two parents are accused. There's a husband and wife, a mother and father in this family of their own 7 kids and this adopted girl. Each one gets a separate lawyer because they're being held separately in different prisons. And the father, Royal, is the lawyer for the mother. So he goes to meet the mother in prison. He also goes to interview the grandmother, the mother's mother, and he speaks to her. And there's those of you who read it remember that passage where he meets her. And the author just writes in a style, kind of a very, when he's dealing with the trial, a very matter-of-fact style. So we, the reader, can form the picture the way the author chooses to present it to us. So it turns out that as I said, this family are very fundamental Christians, but not. They have their own way of bringing up children that seems to be particularly strict, but to the mother, there's something wrong with the mother. And he shows us this because when he goes to interview the grandmother, the mother of the mother, he realizes that this woman too, and this makes things, morally a little bit more complicated for us readers, that the woman who committed the crime, or who was accused of committing the crime of abusing this adopted daughter of hers, her own mother was a very disturbed and seemingly cruel woman with strange ideas of child raising. So that the mother she's a very difficult character to have, because you're not supposed to have any sympathy for her, and she committed terrible acts, it seems. But she herself came from a family where the method of child rearing involved a lot of physical abuse. The children there the siblings of this adopted girl are also brought, the older ones are also called to testify during the trial. And we get a picture. And if you've ever seen or watched or read about these, and there are similar, unfortunately, trials, where you see that in families where this kind of terrible abuse occurs, the other children become most often unwilling, but they're victims of the same child rearing methods and cruelty as they all are, and their children are not usually in a position to rebel or to do anything against it, and that's what comes out in this trial. So the bulk of the story then, the middle section of the story, is the description of the trial and what goes on and who takes the stand. And it's that way that he's able to present the girl, because he said in an interview, the author said, so, the characters, who's the main character in the story, he's asked. He said, well, that's kind of I don't want to say that there's one particular main story. It's the Royal, the father of the narrator, is the main character, you could say, in the middle of the story. He's the lawyer defending this very abominable, or at least to us, woman. But the girl herself is an important character, because without her, there would be no trial and probably no story. But she's not there. So he said, I had to figure out a way to present her. So he tells her through the eyes of those who are called onto the stand. And we get a picture of this girl. And he said, that's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to make her a character. And I wanted her to be not just a one-dimensional victim. I wanted to show who she was. She was a bright, feisty, strong-willed girl who had gone through many difficulties in her very brief life. She came from a terrible situation in Ethiopia, which was why she was put into an orphanage there in the first place, and was supposed to have gone to America to be adopted and move on to a better life. But sadly and tragically, as in the real case, that didn't happen because of the family she was placed with. As David Guterson said, the other girl, my daughter, who I adopted from an orphanage in Ethiopia, it could have been her. Like, it didn't. It was so tragic that for this young girl, the story turned out so badly. But let's say for the others and most of the others who are adopted by loving, kind, caring families who don't have terrible sadistic ideas of how to bring up children, including all kinds of them, the corporal punishment methods that they used are described in detail at the trial, because that's the point of the trial. So she comes alive to us, this young girl who had been brought to America, who had lived there for a few years until she dies on that cold and rainy night of hypothermia outside in the yard of the house of her adopted family. And then the trial concludes, and eventually there's a decision, and the woman is found guilty. And as the narrator's father has said to him, 9 times out of 10, the accused, he knows that, and throughout, after many years of his practice, the accused is found guilty. So that wasn't any surprise that this happened, but she got a fair trial. And that's the point of it, as he explains to his son, because everybody in our system is owed a trial, whatever you think of them. And that ends that second section. The third part of the book is called post-trial. And it's during this time. So the father he gets through the trial, and we know that he has, he actually doesn't finish the trial, because towards the very end, one day when his son they've just finished a day in court, and it's afterwards, and his father says, I'm a little bit tired, and he sits down on a chair and he says, just give me a minute or two. And he puts his hand on his knees, and he bends his head down, and his son also goes away a little bit to give his father some space, and also they sit there for a while. And then after the narrator realizes that his father isn't really moving and something isn't quite right, and he goes over to his father. And it seems like, he doesn't say in so many words that his father has had a stroke. And he's taken to the hospital, and he passes away a few days after that. So he doesn't quite get to finish the trial, but that's the end of the father-son relationship, which was something that had been developed during this period where the son doesn't know what to do with himself, because all of a sudden he doesn't want to write fiction anymore, and how's he going to fill his days? And then he becomes his father's driver, which turns out to be a very lovely thing for him, because he got to spend a lot of time with his father, not knowing that these were going to be the last weeks of his father's life, but it definitely served a purpose for the son. And the last section of the book, he writes about, so it's post-trial, his father is no longer with them, and he has to figure out now how is he going to fill the son, the unnamed narrator? How is he going to fill the rest of his days? He doesn't really tell us. The book doesn't end with any concrete ideas about how this is going to come. What he's going to do. But the last section of the book is interesting, because those of you who read it, there's a lot of different discussions. There's a lot of different books mentioned. It's as if his authorial side of him comes out, and we find out. Well, we knew this from the very beginning. So of the 2 children, the son, the unnamed narrator, is a fiction writer, and the daughter owns a tea room. And the daughter is described as this very tall, she's 6'4", and she's a large woman. And she opens a tea room. There she is in Seattle, a tea room with very fancy, teas that people spend probably pay a lot of money to buy. And her tea room is very popular there in Seattle. Doesn't do so well in the summer when the weather is warm, but it comes the rainy, cold season outside, her tea room does very well. And there you have, in her tea room, all kinds of discussions take place. Because, a la coffee houses in Europe or tea rooms, this was a place where intellectuals would come and they would sit and they would philosophize. And so the last section of the book, now that the trial is over, the narrator's father is no longer alive, that job is over. He takes to going to the tea room to sit there, because he actually has to fill his days in. He doesn't have his father to drive around anymore if he's not going to be writing. So he goes and he sits in this tea room and he observes people. It turns out that he's also been a mentor, our unnamed narrator, when he was a writer, because he was a well-known writer. He's a mentor to younger writers, and some come to him and they ask his advice. And there are a couple of funny vignettes at the end, in that last section of the book, where I think it's David Gutterson, very softly satirizing or at least describing some of the issues that modern day folk, first world problems, sitting in this cafe in Seattle where very expensive teas are sold and people make a whole thing of, you know, these kinds of, there's the whites and the greens and the blacks and the this, and they have fancy names, and people are connoisseurs of tea. Like, I don't know, there's a whole thing with tea. And you have writers coming and sitting there, and one of the writers comes to speak to our unnamed narrator and starts to complain to him. And he says to him, you know, I was born in the wrong time because I'm white and I'm male, and nobody wants to read books now by white male writers. You have to be of a certain ethnicity, and you should be female, and you should be this, and you should be that. But white male writers are definitely not the ones that anybody wants to read. And he bemoans the fact. And that was like one of the funny scenes. And into that, he brings in, David Gutterson references Philip Roth and his patrimony, his book about his father. He also references Pushkin and the French, the name is Remembrances of Things Past. And his sister, what she does in her tea room is she has a big blackboard, chalkboard, and every day or every once in a while, she writes these quotes by writers. Big quotes on and you have Pushkin there one day, and then you have Proust there one day, and then you have something from a Japanese poems about tea books another day. And this becomes kind of the hate, and she's the sister of the unnamed narrator, so he gets a good spot all the time when he goes to sit in her tea room. And that tea room becomes the last place where, just as his father used to go to his office every day with his briefcase, with his brand plates, and just so he would have a place to go, that our unnamed narrator, who's at loose ends because he doesn't know what he's going to do with himself anymore, goes to sit in this tea room where he can soak in the ambiance, sit there with his cup of tea, and the tea comes with a little timer, we're told, so that you know exactly just how long the tea has to brew. Each tea, white and green and black, has an optimum brewing time and that's when you should drink it. So there is, as I say, this bit of sarcasm and satire on what this white male writer, who is our unnamed narrator, is living in his last days. He's also grieving the loss of his father. And that's where it becomes elegiac in its writing, because it's through this trial, the horrors of that trial, where he sees his father at his best and his father at work, and then his father suddenly leaves them, and he sees what a good, kind, decent man his father was. And he's left with the grieving, because his father has only recently died. Luckily for him, he has a wife, and the relationship between the two of them is portrayed as a very close and a very loving one. So he has her to comfort him. His mother is a very kind and decent woman. And now you have the feeling that between the unnamed narrator and his sister, they're going to take as good care of their mother as they can now that she has lost her husband. And he sits there at the end and he tells us, one of the things that I liked about fiction writing was that its harder emotions could be lived at a remove. I was making things up. None of it was happening. If someone suffered, they didn't really suffer. If someone died, they weren't really dead. Because it's fiction. It's just a book, remember, just a novel. What happened only in my head. What happened didn't matter in the end. If a character fell from a cliff while sitting for a portrait, lived 20 years with unrequited love, succumbed to a stroke on the third floor of a courthouse, that was his father, or died in the cold after being starved and lashed, the girl. If any of these things happened on a page I'd invented, the consequences in painful emotion were felt only at a distance. So here he's telling us why he writes fiction. I'm not saying that I never felt emotion while making things up and setting them on paper. I'm saying that what I felt lacked the force of things I didn't make up. No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. Someone famous supposedly said. But that brand of tears, however integral to life, is foreign to it also. Tears of a different order, so to speak, that fall cathartically in the main, allowing us an out and granting false cleansing. As for my own tears, as I shed them over the years, while fictionalizing, they were shed, it should be noted, obvious as it may be, in the midst of fabulation. So he said, what he's saying in all this language, is that when I write, I create. Everything that I make up, even if it causes me as a writer to cry, and you as a reader to cry and feel terribly upset because the story is so disturbing, it's only made up. Sometimes now, when I think of my father, and after having written all of this, I think of King Lear, the character and the play both. How does my royal lord, his daughter asks him toward his end, and narrator's father's name is Royal, you'll remember. How does my royal lord? To which he replies, you do me wrong to take me out of the grave. Thou art a soul in bliss, but I am bound upon a wheel of fire that mine own tears do scald like molten lead before telling her you do not love me. Well, that's King Lear and his daughter. Then he brings in Philip Roth's Patrimony. When Philip Roth, I don't know if anybody remembers this, he reminded me of this. Philip Roth dreams that his recently deceased father, Herman, had returned from the grave to rebuke his son for having dressed him in the wrong clothes for his funeral. And so then he brings in Patrimony. Yeah, that's Philip Roth's kind of humor. And then he goes, like that's the thing, and he brings all these different books. The Japanese death poems written by Zen monks and haiku poems on the verge of death. So he's reading here and he's trying to come to some kind of conclusion about the meaning of our lives and mortality and the ends of all of us. And the last scene, he goes, at the end of the day, he goes to bed, he's there with his wife, who, as I said, they have a very good relationship, the two of them, very close, very loving, and she's the one who's been given this book of these Japanese poems by his sister, the owner of the tea shop. And she says to him, your dad kept his sword sharp right to the end, but now he's gone, and so are my parents. And your mother, I don't know, maybe she's wide awake right now in her bed by herself with the wind blowing outside. And at the last sentences of the book, he turns to his wife in the dark and he's like, as if to say, so what do we do now? What keeps us going? And his wife says to him, we can love people. What else is there? So, and that's how he ends the story. So you have this story about terrible things that people can do to each other and the trial and this idea. And then you have, on the other hand, the very loving, nurturing relationships and how kind and good and decent people can be. So that's the whole, as I said, there's the pre-trial, there's the trial, there's the post-trial, and there's all different kinds of things woven into this not very long novel, barely 250 pages. I don't know if this is going to be the last piece of fiction by David Gutter. I mean, he's relatively young, so I don't know. But as I say, it's called The Final Case. His narrator says he's not writing fiction, but it's a piece of fiction. So who knows what his next book will be. Thank you very much. Is there any questions that anybody wants to say? I don't believe.
If I missed it, was there any punishment needed to the couple who mistreated Montevideo?
Yes, they were found guilty. They were found guilty of child abuse. They were sentenced to prison. Yeah. But they did. But as his father said to him, it's not going to be on the charge. He calls it. He doesn't say first degree and second degree or manslaughter because the charge was that they would be convicted that she would have died by abuse. And I mean, it was a technicality of the law, but it didn't get the are convicted and they're sentenced. 37 years, I think. I don't know about the later ones, because Snow Falling on Cedars definitely was between, you know, the royalties and the one prizes and the film rights. That's what made him a wealthy man. Are his later books, I don't think they had the same, at least the same popular acclaim. I don't know, has anybody read any of his later novels? No, so Snow Falling on Cedars made it big to all the book clubs and all the, you know, it won the Penn Guggenheim Award, and I haven't read them, I must, as I say, so I don't know. But I don't think he really needed to worry after Snow Falling on Cedars. Yeah.
Together tonight.
Yeah.
Final
Yeah,
book.
I think so.
Yeah, the fonts, right, okay.